So thanks for coming, Rich.
Good to be here.
So we'll start with the first question. So what do you perceive as the key primary role of the built environment as a support for community building and development?
So the way we look at it at Free Center is all aspects of community building are rooted in symbols, right? That we're in this constant search for what might be the next battle cry that galvanizes a community, that helps folks recognize the power within. And the primary role to us of the actual built environment is to stand as a symbol for something. And that symbol is often in our work about the allocation of power. And so the correlation between built environments and this perception of power, which is also a perception of capacity, is really critical. There is this adage that we've been stating for years that space is power. It creates a kind of gravitas, a centralized, focused point of access that ends up being the visual definition of all of the movement that's happening in community.
That's powerful. It's a powerful statement.
But that's how we see it, and part of what happens is it's because of that, it ends up being fairly temporal, right? That space doesn't become just a static bed of power. It's how power moves through a community, right? So space, we stop looking at it in terms of, here are these four walls and they're fixed, and what happens within them is fixed or modular to the degree that that folks who've made some decisions about that space treat it as modular.
So it's confining.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to constantly break the confines. In a lot of ways, in terms of symbols of space, we see this idea of mirrors as lining all the walls of a space, right? So that the folks within it can see themselves wherever they happen to be looking. Not literally so, right? But those reflective qualities, the ability for us to see ourselves where we are, is how we take a look at space in a lot of ways, right? But then what that also means is that that space is in a constantly attempting to redirect that power, to reallocate the power in a lot of ways, right? To take the power that was assigned to the space and bring it back to the people so that they could take it wherever it needs to go.
And that's what you're doing at Free Center.
That's what
right?
we're looking to do. Yeah. That's really what we're looking to do. I think that we operate in places where certain levels of access have been stripped away from communities. It's not that these communities lack power, right? Everybody's got agency and has power, but the apparition of power is taken away, right? And there's this conceit that that power's a thing that's given to, and not a thing that's born from, and we're out to not actually give anybody any power, right? We're out to
empower,
help folks recognize the power within, right? And we will leverage anything to do that, to help make that point, to help drive that point home. And space is one of those things that we use to leverage that point. And so we are the first Free Center that we opened in Hartford is in a former library. It was a place that was closed down, a library in a community that could have used the library, was closed down. And the community was without its central place of gathering, its central point of access, to information, access to supports. The
Community.
Yeah, the basics, right? So, in a lot of ways, libraries had become all of the above. It had become a library, it become town hall, it become gathering space, right? It become a safe space for youth. It encapsulated so much meaning, so many symbols,
Yeah.
within these walls, right? And all of them are fairly iconic symbols at that. And that branch was closed.
And that's a big shoe to fill.
It's a big shoe to fill. Yeah. And my first couple of days in this space, I thought that I'd have the luxury of being closed on Fridays. Because that's what we'd been doing. We were working 4-day weeks. It was very, very chic of us. And gosh, that first Friday, I was in this big open space, walking around playing my guitar, thinking I'd have the day to myself. And it was the day to fill out Section 9 housing applications. And, the community was knocking on the door of a place that wasn't open for business yet, right? And when I initially thought that I would send folks somewhere else to another space.
There's nowhere else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there were other places, but this building, it was the symbol.
It was symbolic too.
Right? It held all of the meaning. It wasn't just what was functional in it, it was theirs, right? They didn't need a support, they needed their support.
They didn't need to be invited, they were going to come anyways.
Exactly. So what ended up happening is we just opened the doors. And I put the guitar down and started helping all of the folks who needed assistance. And we recognized really quickly what was happening within these spaces and the kind of trust that was built with the space, because it was immediately transferred to me. And I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never done a Section 9 form before, right? But folks were coming in entrusting that what was behind the facade of this building was something that they could count on. And boy, that was I paused, and I shared that with my team when they got in on Monday morning, and we all took a pause. And we had this idea that the space itself mattered.
So this response was unexpected.
The response was completely unexpected. We had started with this idea that the building itself, that the space mattered. We had this idea that power, that the symbol of power was a fixed point, right? That we could leverage in different ways over and over again for the betterment of the community. We very quickly recognized that it was all transitory. That this was more of a turnstile of power, that folks come in and they gather and it builds as you keep moving through these more and more people through this turnstile. The space stopped being about the four walls and started being a catalyst for what happens outside. Wow. And then we got hit by COVID.
Yeah, so
right?
How did you pivot?
We got clear about what we were doing. We got clear that folks weren't occupying the four walls, but that commitment to assuring that power stayed where power belonged was a mission that didn't shift at all. So we were helping folks create digital connections. We were helping to support mutual aid programs that were getting stuff to folks who are locked in. We started building a tighter network around arts and culture. Because we find that that this overlooked spot, very often overlooked spot, of arts and culture that doesn't seem like it's doing the downstream work, the work that's the day-to-day work that's immediate versus the strategic work that happens all upstream.
That's
right?
really building culture.
Exactly. Exactly. So there's this art and culture has been designated in these sort of upstream places, the highfalutin ways of looking at stuff. And we recognized in the midst of COVID that arts and culture was at the grassroots. Arts and culture was what was helping folks get vaccinated, staying home, wearing masks, that created a kind of protective cocoon around communities such that they didn't fracture during this time of isolation. And that had nothing to do with walls, right? The walls, again, were just a conduit to this other activity.
To the community that's creating it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
It's beautiful.
So we do think a lot then in terms of, what's in a space and how it's used. I think I mentioned a little while ago, this idea of mirrors. We had this idea the other day. We were having a conversation and we were like, well, a doctor's office is a built space, right? But who's it built for? Right? Let's get clear about who it's built for and what the actions are that need to happen in that space. We got really quickly to this understanding that to us, there are only 3 spaces that exist. There's the space where you rest, the space where you emerge, and then there's the space where you're laid to rest, right? And that's it. So if we are constantly thinking in terms of, what space are we designing for? Is this the resting space? Is that other resting space? Or is this that space where something is emerging?
Deconstructing everything else that we think is being prescribed there.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So then the waiting room at the doctor's office no longer becomes the place where you sit and wait for your turn, right? And let's create some comfort around that. Let's start thinking about in terms of like, how can this set up an emergence? What's going to come of us next from this time and from this experience? And so, it got to this idea of mirrors that we were talking about. It's like, well, what if this place is lined with mirrors such that before you enter that office, you're actually seeing yourself. You're having engagements with yourself over and over again to prepare yourself in a way, that all of you could come out in that session together, And then what happens if doorways are mirrors that, that folks come through to greet you, so that they're superimposed over your own image of self? What happens at that point to our human connection, right? It's all, to us, it's all symbols, right? And it's all, and those sequences are symbols as well. And so as we start thinking about the space in Free Center, and as we start throwing away the initial ideas of like, well, here's this phenomenally, multi-use furniture that we could purchase, and here's these moving walls and all of these ideas about what we could bring into it, we ended up taking a look at the space as a turnstile or as a souk in some way, right? And we sat back and saw what the community wanted to bring into the space. What showed up at our doors quite often.
And what was that? Yeah.
It was stools. It was, a lot of hassocks showed up. It was a little garden cart that's a bus
Wow.
that we stick plants on. It was a player piano showed up. In the Hartford space, a baby grand piano showed up.
Wow.
And all of these things came in from the community, right? And they are moved around all the time. And they start creating these spaces and the sense of the culture and how the community sees itself. We now have areas that have racks of clothes that was nothing at all in the design of the space that we'd imagined, but it's there and it comes out all the time, and events are built around it, and those events now are used as a means of organizing community around a common interest, right? Around the resources and the stuff that we have laying around that is of value to community. So I guess the simplest way for us to look at it is that we believe in space, but we don't believe in space as the final destination, right? We believe in space as a means of catalyzing some change and setting us up for what's next all the time.
Absolutely. So there's a lot to unpack here, but how do you see your organization evolving? And how can we support that evolution?
Okay. How we see Free Center as an organization evolving is, well, that's an interesting challenge. Right now, we're seeing that that Free Center is really about relationships. And I think that all of community organizing, which is essentially what we're doing, is about relationship building, and we learn about each other and all issues of equity, all of the talk about dismantling systems of racism, all of that stuff comes down to who are we in relationship with, and how well are we listening to each other, and what kind of purposeful, positive collisions are taking place that catalyze change, in perception, that catalyze change in attitude, that catalyze changes in invitation to proximity, and all of those things are essential. And to us, the only way to really do that is to build more free centers. We've got 2 right now. We're looking at other sites and other opportunities. The 2 that we've got are built on 2 completely different models. One was a self-funded model in the middle of a small city. The other one was a partnership with the city and the library in a somewhat larger city. And there's opportunities right now for corporate connections in some other spaces that would benefit from the portal that Free Center offers to what the pulse of a community really is. And I think one way that we could partner with lots of folks is in identifying where this can happen, and in showing up and being a part of it. I think that there are a couple of ways that we look at the fiber of communities. There are folks who live there. There are folks who engage there, and there are folks who support there. And we'd love to see all 3 of those come together to create a bigger, broader, more rooted sense of community. And there's this idea for us also about the tension of boundaries, the tension of borders, the tension of regions, and how we define a city or outer ring, suburbs, etc. How do we use the work that we're doing right now, the exposure, the connectivity, to start dissolving these artificial layers, these borders? We're really fascinated with the work that we're seeing happen now, where, say, in the city of Hartford, the vast number of nonprofits and food shelters and homeless shelters are all in the city, creating a financial burden in a lot of ways in the city itself, while the outer ring suburbs are rich with tax bases, right? Hence you end up with schools that have more access to resources and to different caliber of education and you know and it's these borders are creating a kind of separation that doesn't serve anybody in the long run. And I think that some of the cultural deficits that are taking place in some of the outer ring suburbs that are missing some of the vibrancy that's happening in the cities themselves. That's a suffering, right? That's a suffering imposed by this artifice of order.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. So how do we break down these borders without and relocating without making it inaccessible? How do we make it accessible to everybody and also break down the borders?
I think we have to create conditions where people cross the borders, and I think that there's a lot of folks who on both ends are unwilling to cross the borders. We were doing some work in a part of Hartford called the North End, primarily Black, and a high need community, right? Right up against them is the town of West Hartford, which is, I believe Forbes ranks it as one of the 9 best places to live in the country. It keeps routinely getting that designation, right? They're right up against each other, right? The folks in West Hartford, and let's talk about youth for a second. The youth in West Hartford don't cross that line. They do not cross that line into the North End readily. Concurrently, these kids in the North End don't cross the line into West Hartford either. We've had our own experiences with that, with what happens when you cross the line and sirens spinning and and getting pulled over for routine traffic stops, as my poet friend Frederick Douglass Knowles would say, and those are boundaries that you don't even see. It's just a street. It's just asphalt, like it's asphalt anywhere else.
Yeah.
And boy, the boundary makes itself known, and space defines itself in that way. And I think that if we intentionally stand together and hold hands and cross these borders back and forth, cross the borders, holding hands with the willing, and extend that network and extend that network and extend that network, the artifice of border will be seen as what it is.
You can redefine the symbol.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You'll see the lie that you'll see what was cast as opposed to what is. And I think that that's how we do it, right? And so what we need are folks who cross the borders and step into new spaces and not necessarily to create safe spaces, but to create change spaces. And I think that we're onto something then, right? I think something that became very, very clear to me early on was the idea of showing up. And in a lot of ways, that's what Free Center is doing, right? It shows up. We showed up. We didn't know what we were doing. We had no great plan other than to realize that there's an opportunity to just share space that we weren't using.
And the community saw that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So let me tell you, I'm sitting here, right, here in this space being interviewed, and there's a conference room. Not a conference room, sorry. There's a reception area. And, we had a reception area, and you could count how many hours a day, how many hours a month that thing was used on one hand, right? And then you had all this other time where that space went unused, right? You have a kitchen that gets used an hour and a half a day, right?
So you did some post-occupancy evaluations.
Yeah. Well, you know what it's called. Yeah. We were like, whoa, opportunity, right?
Yeah, no,
is
absolutely.
all that we saw. And so if a conference room is used 2 hours a day, there's a lot of time where the community can use that space at no cost, right? Completely free. And so we set up a system where we got a lot more space for the same price, and it became, once we started talking about the access to space for free, there's an audacity to that. There's this need first to check under the hood to see if this is real.
Yeah.
What are they selling? Let's kick the tires on this thing to see what the catch is, right? And as soon as it was clear that there was no catch, and that we meant it, that this thing is free and for the community, and we're going to work together to build what the community imagines, and to support it with all the resources that we could figure out how to access on behalf of the community. And I think the initial response to that, community-wide, was a kind of cathartic giggle. They're like, wait a minute, this is real. This is actually free.
That's amazing.
And there was something kind of like light and goofy about it, that people kept showing up, and it almost felt like they were expecting that there's a camera in the corner capturing this, like it was a spoof of some sort, like they were getting punked. And so folks started
Getting more comfortable, and
they
never
didn't
needed
have
to.
time to get comfortable. They didn't have time to get comfortable because the space of comfort got overridden by imagination.
I love it.
And by possibilities, and by like this flood of things that were incubating in the back of the collective minds, all just started coming to be.
And shouldn't that always be the goal of every space?
Yes. That we're not looking at this little space that's defined by these walls, and by virtue of defined by these walls, defined by this idea of scarcity, right? That it's only this, right? That the community came at it with this kind of largesse of possibilities. There was, oh my God, here's the story. There was this open mic night, right? Not an open mic night, sorry. It was a Make Music Hartford Day, part of the Make Music Day that happens nationally, right? We were hosting that at Free Center because, we inherited this building with Wi-Fi speakers and, and microphones and all the sound system built into it, right? So folks just showed up to perform. And this one girl, I think she was 16 years old, showed up with her little recorder, that played like karaoke music in the background that stripped the vocals out. And she sang along. Now, it was early. And so I was trying to we were all trying to actually get a little bit of work done while this was happening in the background. We thought it would be a lovely thing to have in the background of our day, And this young woman started singing, and I just paused mid-word, turned, and went to sit by her to just listen and listen and listen. And I couldn't get back to work for anybody else that was performing that day, because it's like, I am missing the opportunity to be enriched right now, right? So we sat and listened, and at the end of that day, that 16-year-old felt so confident, and this was her first time out performing in front of anybody. She felt this sense of can do, that she approached this and asked if she could do a concert there herself one day, that she'd make the invitations, that she'd reach out to community, and she'd bring people in, and she'd get friends to cook some food so that there could be stuff to serve there, and she'll bring waters, that she's sure that someone would help her do this. And she did this. She made this happen. She performed. She showed up.
It sounds like that's what success looks like for Free Center.
That's what success looks like for everybody.
Yes. Good point. Thank you.
It's about getting hit with the sudden realization that you are everything, that's needed. And she recognized that she had in her everything that was needed to pursue this thing that she thought might be like this weird childish dream.
And it came to fruition in that moment.
It absolutely came to
That's
fruition.
beautiful. Yeah.
And this is her passion, right? And she's moving through it, and she's supported for it. And the community came out, and the sound was blasted into the street, and people came in off the street, so it wasn't just the folks that she knew, right? That's one story. I think that we've got a million of them at this point, thousands of them at this point, that are exactly like that. And it is not at all, and I can't say it enough, it is not at all about what happened in that space. It's about what went beyond that space that day. It's about what happens to that 16-year-old when she walks through the doors and goes back into the community with a sense of confidence in herself that she shares with others, that stands as an opportunity to drop these little nodules of capacity that we can into our community.
A symbol. In a way. Yeah. Well, I know that a lot of people are going to be really, really inspired by how you deconstruct space, even though that's not technically what we're in the business of. We're constructing space. But how can the design community support Free Center and also support spaces like Free Center? What can we do to help?
The fascinating thing is right now there are not a lot of spaces like Free Center. Right?
Yeah,
which is the thing that we've recognized, that there's an audacity in what we're doing. That's one part just naivete, right? It's trusting in spirit, which could be read as naive, right? And in another part, actually knowing how money moves. What folks who invest in community are looking to invest in. So we spent a lot of time building those relationships, right? And because of that weird intersection between the two, there aren't a lot of free centers. I think how the design community can be really helpful is to, first of all, re-examine how we talk about space. Continue to re-examine that and continue to decentralize the format. Not so much decentralize, but de-emphasize the need for formal space. There are so many gorgeous lectures and schools of thought around space and meaning. And so much of it sits at the theoretical level. I think that the idea of radically moving forward and sharing this kind of thinking, this kind of spirited approach with clients to encourage them to think about the meaning in all aspects of their space, not just the function, but the meaning. And to start corporatizing, in a way, this way of thinking about spirit and space. I remember the first time I did a lecture and decided, oh well, to heck with it. I'm just going to use the word love over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? That I stripped out all the jargon and just started talking about love, right? Something changed for me in that moment, and I think something changed for some of the corporate folks who are in that room who are listening to it. That there is this daring to move forward and, maybe try a thing that doesn't fit naturally into these formal structures. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a thing that the design community could start doing, operating more from this gut and the sense of spirit and the sense of human connection, and less about what's sellable and less about
What's expected?
yeah, exactly. I think that I do value meeting people where they are. You know, we started with this. With Free Center started with the formal space because folks understood that, right? You know, so I do value meeting people where they are. But then we got to be clear about where we're headed from there and start that movement towards where we're headed immediately.
That's beautiful.
And
Yeah. I think that's something that everybody can get on board with, that there's a bridge to get there, but we have to take the bridge.
yeah, beautiful.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank
speaking
you.
with us, Rich. We
Quite a
really
pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Quite a pleasure.